A lonely widow volunteered at a nursing home. Shocked to find her high school sweetheart there, Margaret Carson realized life had an unexpected chapter waiting to be written. The revelation came on an ordinary Tuesday in October, when autumn's first real chill had settled over Millfield. She'd started volunteering 3 weeks prior, still struggling to fill the cavernous silence her husband's passing had left in their farmhouse of 42 years. The nursing home smelled of antiseptic and yesterday's pot roast. Margaret had grown accustomed to it, just as she'd grown accustomed to the hollow space beside her in bed. Adaptation was her specialty these days. Surviving, moving forward one mechanical step after another. "You're with Mr. Pearson today." The volunteer coordinator, a cheerful woman named Diane, told her. "Room 217. He's been with us just 2 weeks. Hardly talks to anyone, but maybe you'll have better luck." Margaret nodded, tucking a strand of silver-streaked auburn hair behind her ear. At 67, her face carried the gentle topography of a life fully lived, laugh lines around her eyes, a certain softness around her jaw that hadn't been there in youth. She smoothed her cardigan, checked her name badge, and made her way down the hall lined with watercolor landscapes and motivational phrases. Room 217. The door was partially open. She knocked gently. "I've told you 3 times, I don't need anything," came a gruff voice from inside. Margaret hesitated. Something about that voice, a certain timbre, a distinctive cadence, tugged at a forgotten corner of her memory. "I'm not staff," she said, pushing the door open wider. "I'm a volunteer." "I thought you might like some company." The man in the bed by the window turned, sunlight catching the silver in his hair. His face was thinner, more angular than she remembered, but those eyes, that particular shade of hazel with flecks of gold, hadn't changed in 50 years. Their gazes locked. The book he'd been holding slipped from his fingers. "Maggie?" he whispered, his voice suddenly fragile, stripped of its gruffness. The room tilted beneath her sensible shoes. Her hand flew to the doorframe for support. "Jack," she breathed. Jack Pearson. 50 years dissolved between them. She was 17 again, standing beneath the old oak tree by Miller's Creek, his varsity jacket around her shoulders, promising forever to a boy who left for Vietnam and never came back to her. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. Jack Pearson had disappeared from her life before her 20th birthday. She'd grieved him, then eventually met Edward, married him, built a life. And now, after all this time, after burying her husband just 14 months ago, here was Jack, impossibly, inexplicably real. "They told me your volunteer's name was Margaret," he said, struggling to sit up straighter. I never made the connection." "Carson, they said." "Not Mitchell." "I married," she said simply. "Edward Carson. He passed last year." Jack's eyes softened. "I'm sorry, Maggie." The nickname landed like a physical touch. No one had called her Maggie in decades. "I should go," she said suddenly, backing toward the door. This was too much, too unexpected. The past rushing up to meet her with such force it left her breathless. "I'll ask Diane to assign me somewhere else." "Don't," Jack said too quickly. Then softer. "Please." Margaret hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. She should leave. This room contained too many ghosts, too many unanswered questions from half a century ago. But something in his eyes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, kept her rooted to the spot. "Why are you here, Jack?" she asked, not moving closer, not yet. "What happened to you?" He gestured to his leg, where the blanket lay flat where his right calf and foot should have been. "Vietnam happened. Then life. Then a stroke 3 weeks ago. My daughter lives across the country." "This was the only place with an opening." Margaret nodded, absorbing this information, trying to reconcile this man with the 18-year-old boy who'd promised to come back to her. "And you?" he asked. "Why are you here of all places?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. The silence got too loud. Understanding passed between them, a current of shared experience that needed no elaboration. "Would you—" Jack cleared his throat. "Would you sit with me? Just for a little while?" Margaret hesitated only a moment before moving to the chair beside his bed. She sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, unsure what to do with this collision of past and present. "I looked for you," he said finally. "When I came back, they told me you'd moved away. My father got transferred to Indianapolis," she said. "After you stopped writing, there didn't seem to be any reason to stay." Jack's face clouded. "I wrote every week, Maggie. For almost a year." The confusion must have shown on her face because he leaned forward, eyes intense. "You never got my letters?" Margaret shook her head slowly. The last letter I got was dated March 14th, 1969. You said you'd been transferred to a new unit. After that, nothing. Jack fell back against his pillows, a mixture of disbelief and dawning understanding crossing his features. Your father, he said softly. He never liked me. The possibility had never occurred to Margaret, but as soon as Jack spoke the words, their truth settled into her bones. Her father, so determined that his daughter would go to college, would make something of herself, not tie herself to a boy he considered beneath her. He wouldn't have, she began, but the protest died on her lips. Because he would have. He absolutely would have. I came back to Millfield in '71, Jack continued. Spent 6 months in a VA hospital first. Your mother told me you were engaged to a medical student in Indianapolis. She lied, Margaret whispered, 50 years of alternate possibilities spinning through her mind. I didn't meet Edward until '73. Jack's gaze held hers, 5 decades of loss passing between them. I should go, Margaret said again, rising abruptly. This was too much to process, too much history unraveling at once. Will you come back? The vulnerability in his voice almost undid her. Margaret paused at the door, unable to look back at him. I don't know, Jack. I honestly don't know. She made it to her car before the tears came, hot and sudden. She gripped the steering wheel, forehead pressed against it as sobs racked her body. For the girl she'd been, for the boy he'd been, for the life they might have had if not for war and well-intentioned deception. That evening, Margaret sat in Edward's study, a room she rarely entered since his death. She opened the bottom drawer of his desk where he'd kept his important papers and pulled out their wedding album. Edward smiled up at her from the photographs, kind, steady Edward who'd loved her patiently, who'd been a good husband, a good father to their children. They'd had a good life together. Not perfect, but good. She traced his face with her fingertip. What do I do now? She whispered to the empty room. No answer came, just the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, marking another minute, another hour in a life suddenly thrown into confusion. Margaret didn't return to Lakeview Nursing Home the following day, or the day after. She called Diane and made excuses, a cold, a doctor's appointment, a leaky pipe that needed fixing. On the 5th day, her daughter called. Mom, are you okay? Diane from the nursing home called me. She's worried about you. Margaret sighed, sinking into her kitchen chair. I'm fine, Julie. Just needed some time. Time for what? You were so excited about volunteering. What happened? Margaret hesitated. She hadn't told her children about Jack, hadn't known how to explain encountering a ghost from her youth. I ran into someone I used to know, she said finally. It was unexpected. Someone bad? Julie asked, concern evident in her voice. No, Margaret said softly. Someone I once loved very much, a long time ago. Silence on the other end, then, before Dad? Yes. Before your father. More silence. Then Julie's voice, gentler now. Mom, it's been 14 months. Dad would want you to live your life. It's not that simple, Julie. It never is. But hiding in the house isn't living. After they hung up, Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the maple tree in her backyard surrender its leaves to the October wind. Julie was right. Edward would want her to live. He'd told her as much in those final weeks, holding her hand with what little strength he had left. Promise me you won't shut yourself away, Meg, he'd said. Promise me you'll find joy again. She'd promised, though at the time she couldn't imagine how she'd keep that promise. The next morning, Margaret returned to Lakeview. Her heart pounded as she approached room 217, uncertainty making her steps falter. What if he didn't want to see her? What if he did? She knocked softly. Come in, Jack's voice called. He was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, a book open on his lap. His face brightened when he saw her, then carefully composed itself, as if he was trying not to appear too eager. I thought you weren't coming back, he said. Margaret stood awkwardly just inside the doorway. I wasn't sure I would. Jack nodded, accepting this. I'm glad you did. A silence stretched between them, heavy with 50 years of separate lives. I brought something, Margaret said finally, opening her purse. She pulled out a faded photograph, its edges soft with age, and handed it to him. Jack took it carefully. It showed the two of them at the Millfield Spring Festival, 1968. His arm was around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something now lost to time. He traced the edge of the photo with his finger. You kept this all these years? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Margaret nodded. In my jewelry box. Edward knew about you. I told him everything when we started getting serious. He must have been a good man. He was, she agreed. We had a good life. 2 children. 4 grandchildren now. Jack smiled. I have 3. Grandchildren, that is. Only had 1 daughter, Elaine. She lives in Seattle. Works for some tech company. Is that why you're here and not there? With her? Jack shrugged. She offered, but her life is complicated enough without adding an invalid father to the mix. And I didn't want to be a burden. You're not an invalid, Jack. A stroke doesn't define you. He looked up, surprised at the firmness in her tone. Still fighting other people's battles, I see, he said with a small smile. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. Some habits die hard. Do you remember that time you confronted Tommy Wilson for spreading rumors about Sarah Jenkins? Jack asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You marched right up to him in the cafeteria and told him if he didn't apologize, you'd tell everyone about how he cheated on his algebra final. Margaret laughed, the sound surprising her. I'd forgotten about that. Poor Sarah. She was so shy. You were always braver than the rest of us, Jack said. Always knew exactly what was right. Margaret shook her head. Not always. Not even close. They spent the next hour sharing memories, cautiously at first, then with growing ease as the years between them seemed to compress. Jack told her about his life after Vietnam, marriage to a nurse he'd met during rehabilitation, their daughter's birth, his work as an architect designing homes he drew first during long, painful nights when sleep wouldn't come. Patricia died in 2010, he said. Cancer. It was quick, at least. She didn't suffer long. I'm sorry, Margaret said, and meant it. What about you? Jack asked. What did Margaret Mitchell become after Millfield? Margaret Carson became a librarian, she said with a small smile. Not very exciting, but I loved it. Retired 10 years ago. Edward was a dentist. He loved to fish. Every summer we'd take the kids to a cabin in Michigan. Were you happy? Jack asked, his eyes searching hers. Margaret considered the question, its simplicity belying its complexity. Yes, she said finally. Not every minute, not every day. But yes, I was happy. Relief softened his features. Good. That's good. When Margaret left that day, she promised to return. And she did. The next day and the day after that. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, moving beyond shared memories to the people they'd become in the intervening years. November arrived with bitter winds and early darkness. Margaret found herself looking forward to her time at Lakeview, planning her days around her visits with Jack. She brought him books from her own collection, ones she thought he might enjoy. He shared his sketches with her, architectural drawings he still created despite the slight tremor in his hand from the stroke. You could have been an artist, she told him one afternoon, examining a detailed drawing of a Victorian-style home. Too practical for that, he replied. Had to make a living. It's never too late, she said, surprising herself with the words. To pursue what you love. Jack looked at her for a long moment. No, he said softly. I suppose it isn't. As Thanksgiving approached, Jack's physical therapy intensified. Margaret often arrived to find him exhausted, frustrated by his body's limitations. I hate this, he confessed one day after a particularly difficult session. Being weak, dependent. Margaret sat beside his wheelchair, taking his hand. His skin was cool beneath her fingers, papery but still strong. You're the strongest person I know, Jack Pearson, she said. You always have been. He looked down at their joined hands. Not like before. Not like when we were young. Different strength, she insisted. The kind that matters more. A week before Thanksgiving, Margaret arrived to find Jack's room empty. Panic fluttered in her chest until a nurse directed her to the solarium, where she found him sitting with another resident, a chessboard between them. Jack looked up as she approached, his face lighting in a way that made her heart skip. Maggie! Come meet Harold. He's teaching me chess. Harold, a thin man with wispy white hair, nodded politely. Your young man has a good mind for strategy, Mrs. Carson. Just needs to work on his patience. Margaret smiled at the description. Your young man. So incongruous and yet somehow fitting. He never did have much patience, she agreed, settling into a chair beside them. That's not true, Jack protested. I waited for you, didn't I? The words hung in the air between them, more honest than either had allowed themselves to be. Harold, sensing the sudden tension, excused himself with a knowing smile. I'm sorry, Jack said when Harold had gone. That was true, Margaret finished for him. You did wait, and I didn't know. Jack moved a chess piece absently. What would you have done if you'd gotten my letters? Margaret considered the question, one that had haunted her since their reunion. "I would have waited too," she said finally, "for as long as it took." The admission cost her something, a certain loyalty to the life she'd lived, to Edward's memory. But she owed Jack the truth, after so many years of misunderstanding. "I loved Edward," she said, needing him to understand. "Truly loved him." "But you don't have to explain," Jack interrupted. "We can't change the past, Maggie." "No," she agreed. "But maybe we can understand it better." That evening, Margaret drove home through a light snowfall, the first of the season. The flakes caught in the glow of her headlights, swirling like memories too long suppressed. She thought about Jack's question, what would she have done, and the answer she'd given him. The truth, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated. She would have waited, yes. But what then? Jack had come back damaged in body and spirit. Would her young, idealistic self have had the strength to love him through that? Or would they have broken under the strain, as so many young couples did? Perhaps their separation, painful as it was, had allowed them both to become people strong enough to find each other again. Thanksgiving arrived cold and clear. Margaret's children and grandchildren filled her house with noise and warmth. Julie had insisted on hosting, but Margaret had been equally insistent. This year, more than ever, she needed the distraction of preparation, the comfort of tradition. As they gathered around the table, Edward's absence still palpable in the empty chair at its head, Julie raised her glass. "To Dad," she said, her voice catching slightly. "We miss you every day." "To Edward," Margaret echoed, her heart full. Later, as the children cleared dishes and her son-in-law dozed in front of the football game, Julie found Margaret in the kitchen, staring out the window. "You seem different, Mom," she said, bumping her hip against Margaret's in a gesture of affection. "More present." Margaret smiled. "Do I? It's that mysterious someone from your past, isn't it?" Julie waggled her eyebrows dramatically. Margaret laughed, swatting her daughter's arm. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm 67 years old. Exactly my point. Too young to become a hermit." Julie's expression softened. "Seriously, Mom? It's good to see you engaged with life again." Margaret hesitated, then decided it was time. "His name is Jack. We were in love before your father. Before Vietnam." Julie's eyes widened. "And now he's at the nursing home? What are the odds?" "Astronomical," Margaret agreed. "I'm still trying to make sense of it. Does he make you happy?" The question was so similar to Jack's, "Were you happy?" that Margaret had to catch her breath. "He makes me feel alive," she said finally. "Like I matter beyond being Edward's widow, or your mother, or the grandchildren's grandmother." Julie squeezed her hand. "Then that's enough for now." The day after Thanksgiving, Margaret brought Jack a plate of leftovers. His face lit up at the sight of homemade cranberry sauce and turkey, but even more at the sight of her. "I missed you yesterday," he admitted as she set up the meal on his tray. "I missed you too," she said, surprising herself with her honesty. They settled into comfortable conversation as he ate, Margaret telling him about her grandchildren's antics, Jack sharing a phone call he'd had with his daughter. "She wants me to reconsider moving to Seattle," he said, pushing his empty plate away. "Says she's found an assisted living facility near her home." Margaret's heart contracted painfully. "Oh," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "That would be good, wouldn't it? Being closer to family?" Jack studied her face. "Would it?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that depends on what you want." "What I want," Jack repeated slowly, "is something I'm not sure I have the right to ask for." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Ask anyway." Jack took a deep breath. "I want to know if there's a chance for us, Maggie. Not to recapture what we lost. We're different people now. But to discover who we might be to each other in the time we have left." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I've been asking myself the same question. And I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what people will think. Afraid of dishonoring Edward's memory. Afraid of being hurt again." Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "All valid fears. But," Margaret continued, reaching for his hand, "I'm more afraid of regret. Of walking away from this second chance because I was too cautious to take it." Hope bloomed in Jack's expression. "What are you saying, Maggie?" "I'm saying ask me again. Ask me what you want to ask." Jack entwined his fingers with hers. "Margaret Mitchell Carson, would you consider having dinner with me? Not here, but somewhere real. A date." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Yes, Jack Pearson. I would like that very much." December transformed Millfield into a postcard-perfect small town, with garlands strung across Main Street and shopfronts glittering with lights. Margaret's first official date with Jack was at Lorenzo's, the Italian restaurant that had been a diner when they were teenagers. It took coordination. Jack was still using a wheelchair much of the time, though his therapists were optimistic about his eventual transition to a walker. Margaret arranged for a transportation service that accommodated wheelchairs and spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear. "You look beautiful," Jack said when she met him in the lobby of Lakeview, his eyes taking in her cranberry sweater and pearl earrings, Edward's last Christmas gift to her. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, noting his pressed shirt and the careful way he'd combed his silver hair. Dinner was awkward at first, both hyper-aware of their age, of the curious glances from other diners who recognized Margaret but not the man she was with. But by dessert, they were laughing like the teenagers they'd once been, sharing a tiramisu and brushing hands across the table. "I can't believe how nervous I was," Margaret confessed as they waited for their ride back to Lakeview, "as if I haven't spent nearly every day with you for weeks." "It's different," Jack said. "Outside the nursing home, more real." Margaret understood what he meant. Their time at Lakeview had existed in a bubble, protected from the realities of their separate lives. This, being seen together in public, making choices about a potential future, was stepping into something new. As December progressed, so did Jack's recovery and their relationship. They ventured out more, to a Christmas concert at the high school, to the winter farmers market, to a movie at the small theater downtown. Each excursion became easier, more natural. Margaret introduced Jack to Julie and her family at a Sunday dinner that could have been disastrous, but instead was filled with laughter and new connections. Jack charmed her grandchildren with stories of Millfield in the 1960s and impressed her son-in-law with his knowledge of architecture. "I like him," Julie said later, helping Margaret with the dishes. "He looks at you like you hung the moon." "He always did," Margaret replied softly. As Christmas approached, Jack shared news that was both wonderful and terrifying. His doctors believed he was ready to transition to independent living, with some modifications and support. "I've been looking at apartments," he told Margaret as they decorated a small tree in his room. "There's a complex on Maple Street with first-floor units and accessibility features." Margaret's hands stilled on the ornament she was hanging. "That's wonderful, Jack." He caught her hesitation. But it's a big step. "Living on your own again." Jack wheeled closer, taking her hands. "I was hoping I wouldn't be entirely on my own." Margaret's heart fluttered. "Jack, not asking you to move in," he clarified quickly. "Just hoping you might be a frequent visitor. Maybe help me figure out how to work a smart TV." Margaret laughed, relieved and disappointed in equal measure. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. My grandkids are still trying to teach me how to use my smartphone." "We can learn together," Jack said, his expression growing serious. "That's what I want, Maggie. To learn how to be in this new world together." On Christmas Eve, Margaret invited Jack to her home. She picked him up from Lakeview in the afternoon, driving carefully through streets made slick by freezing rain. Her house welcomed them with warmth and the scent of pine from the tree in the living room. "It's exactly how I imagined your home would be," Jack said as she helped him navigate the 2 steps into the entryway. "Warm, full of books and memories." Margaret glanced around, seeing her home through his eyes, the photographs spanning decades, the worn furniture chosen for comfort over style, Edward's reading glasses still on the side table by his favorite chair. "It's a bit stuck in time," she admitted. "I haven't changed much since Edward died." Jack squeezed her hand. "It's perfect, Maggie. It's you." They spent the evening in comfortable domesticity, Margaret cooking a simple dinner, Jack setting the table from his wheelchair, insisting on helping despite her protests. After they ate, they moved to the living room where Margaret had built a fire in the fireplace. "I have something for you," Jack said, reaching into the bag he'd brought. He pulled out a flat package wrapped in silver paper. Margaret unwrapped it carefully to reveal a framed drawing, her house rendered in perfect detail, but with subtle differences. Flower boxes beneath the windows, a porch swing, a small ramp replacing the front steps. "How did you—" "Julie helped," Jack admitted. "Sent me pictures. I hope you don't mind." Margaret traced the drawing with her fingertip. "It's beautiful, Jack. But why the changes?" Jack took a deep breath. "They're suggestions. Things that would make it easier for me to visit. More often?" Margaret looked up, understanding dawning. "Oh, too much?" he asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. No, she said quickly. Not too much. Just unexpected. I've been thinking, Jack continued, about what happens after Lakeview. About what I want the rest of my life to look like. He reached for her hand. And in every version you're there, Maggie. If you want to be... Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Jack, are you asking... Not marriage, he clarified. Not yet. That would be rushing things. But I am asking if you'll consider a future where we figure this out together. Where your house becomes our house eventually. Where we don't waste any more time. Margaret looked at the drawing again, imagining Jack in this space, reading by the fire, having coffee at her kitchen table, becoming part of the home she'd built with Edward. Would it be a betrayal? Or would it be what Edward had asked of her? To find joy again? Edward and I talked near the end, she said slowly. He made me promise not to spend the rest of my life alone. Said he couldn't bear the thought of this house empty of laughter. Jack waited, patient, giving her space to process. I think, Margaret continued, he would approve of those flower boxes. Jack's smile was like sunrise. Is that a yes? Margaret moved from her chair to sit beside him on the sofa, taking his face in her hands. It's a yes, Jack Pearson. To flower boxes and porch swings and whatever future we can build together. When she kissed him, it was both familiar and new. The boy she'd loved and the man he'd become meeting in a moment that bridged 50 years of separate journeys. Outside, snow began to fall, covering Millfield in a blanket of white, pristine possibility. In January, Jack moved into his apartment on Maple Street. Margaret helped him settle in, arranging his books and hanging his drawings on the walls. They established a rhythm, breakfast together most mornings, dinner at her house several times a week, movie nights and quiet evenings reading side by side. By spring, the additions to Margaret's house were complete. The ramp, the flower boxes, the porch swing built by her son-in-law and painted by her grandchildren. Jack spent more nights there than at his apartment, though they maintained the pretense of separate residences for the sake of propriety and their own readiness. In April, Margaret received a package from Seattle, a letter from Jack's daughter Elaine, along with a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. I found these while cleaning out Dad's storage unit, Elaine wrote. I think they belong with you now. With trembling fingers, Margaret untied the ribbon. 52 letters addressed to Margaret Mitchell in Jack's familiar handwriting, stamped but never sent. The letters her father had intercepted 50 years ago, preserved by Jack all this time. When Jack arrived for dinner, he found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by unfolded letters, tears streaming down her face. Elaine found them, she explained, holding up an envelope. All of them, Jack. Every letter you wrote? Jack lowered himself carefully into the chair beside her, his new walker leaning against the table. I was going to tell you about them. I just wasn't sure how. You kept them all these years? He nodded. Couldn't bear to throw them away. They were all I had left of you. Margaret picked up the last letter, dated January 1970. You asked me to marry you in this one. I did, Jack confirmed softly. Had it all planned out? Was going to give you my mother's ring when I got home. Margaret wiped her tears with the back of her hand. What happened to it? The ring? Jack reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box that looked as aged as the letters. I kept it too. Margaret's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate diamond ring, vintage and perfect. I'm not asking now, Jack said quickly. Just wanted you to see it, to know it was real. Margaret took the box from him, studying the ring that might have been hers half a century ago. Then she looked up at the man before her, not the boy she'd lost, but the man she'd found again, his face lined with experience, his eyes still holding that same light when they looked at her. Ask me, she whispered. Jack's eyes widened. Maggie, ask me, Jack. Not because of what might have been, but because of who we are now. Jack took the box from her, removed the ring with slightly shaking fingers, and took her hand in his. Margaret Mitchell Carson, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Will you marry me? Not to reclaim our past, but to create our future, however long or short it might be. Margaret felt 50 years of separation, of parallel lives lived apart, collapse into this single perfect moment of connection. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will. They were married in May in Margaret's backyard beneath a bower of spring blossoms. Julie stood beside her mother. Elaine flew in from Seattle to stand with her father. Their grandchildren scattered flower petals and took too many pictures on their phones. Jack used his walker to meet Margaret beneath the arch, refusing the wheelchair despite his therapist's concerns. "I want to stand to make these promises," he insisted. Their vows were simple, acknowledging both the love they'd found again and the lives they'd lived apart. "You were my first love," Margaret said, "and now my last. In between, I was blessed with another great love. I bring all that I learned from that life to this one we're building together. 50 years ago, I promised to come back to you," Jack replied. "I'm a little late, but I kept my promise. And now I make you a new one, to cherish every day we have, to waste no time in regret, to love you fully for whatever time we're given." As summer bloomed in Millfield, so did their shared life. Jack's therapy continued, his strength improving until the walker was needed only on his most tired days. They planted a garden together, Jack designing the layout, Margaret doing the physical work under his direction. They traveled to Seattle to visit Elaine and to the coast to see Margaret's son and his family. They began volunteering together at Lakeview, bringing books and conversation to residents who reminded them how fortunate they were to have found each other again. "Do you ever wonder?" Jack asked one evening as they sat on their porch swing watching fireflies rise from the lawn. "What would have happened if we'd gotten it right the first time? If your father hadn't intercepted those letters?" Margaret considered the question, her head resting against his shoulder. "We might have had more years," she said. "But we wouldn't be the people we are now. The people who know how precious time is, how important it is to say what matters while we can." Jack kissed the top of her head. "Wise as always, Maggie Mitchell." "That's Maggie Pearson to you," she corrected with a smile. As the swing moved gently in the evening breeze, Margaret thought about the lonely widow who had volunteered at a nursing home nearly a year ago, searching for purpose in her solitude. She could never have imagined the journey that simple decision would set in motion, the healing of an old wound, the rekindling of a love thought lost, the beginning of a new chapter when she'd thought her story was ending. Some might call it coincidence, finding Jack in that nursing home after 50 years of separation. Others might call it fate or divine intervention. Margaret preferred to think of it as life's remarkable capacity for renewal, for second chances, for healing even the deepest hurts if only we remain open to possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, noticing her contemplative silence. Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'm thinking that sometimes the longest journeys bring us exactly where we need to be." Jack nodded, understanding as he always did. "Home," he said simply. "Home." Margaret agreed, watching the fireflies rise like hopes into the darkening sky, each one a small, persistent light against the gathering night.